Welcome to the Laws of Style, featuring conversations on creativity, fashion, and the law from the leading edge of our economy and culture. Hosted by noted fashion lawyer Douglas Hand.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast, The Laws of Style. Downloading to you from the offices of HBA, high above Bryant Park in the Garment District of New York City. I'm your host, Douglas Hand, fashion lawyer and fashion law professor, and I'm joined by a special guest today, my co-professor at Cardozo Law School, soon to be co-author of the definitive work on fashion law as a casebook and business school text, Barbara Kolsun. Barbara, welcome.
Thank you.
So, Barb, we've been looking forward to this, or at least I've been looking forward to this for a long time. But I want to start at a place that a lot of people may not know about you. You are a titan in the industry. You really, as a fashion lawyer and fashion law professor, you created, honestly, both subjects in the minds of many, including this interviewer. But before that, you were a professional actress and singer. Tell us about those days. Tell us about that pivot, whenever it was, into the law, and how, if at all, that informs what you do now.
Sure. Well, that was my first love, and it's probably one of the reasons why I appreciate creative people. I went to Sarah Lawrence College. I studied with Eva Le Gallienne and Uta Hagen. I worked for 8 years solidly as an actor and singer. And when I was in my late 20s, I started to see some of my friends make that next big move from stage to screen or television, and it wasn't happening fast enough for me, and I was impatient and bored and ready to not be so reliant on one show to another.
Right. And
I decided to do something else. That something else, I got to tell you, it was Doctor, Lawyer, Indian Chief, and I applied to law school, which was $4,000 a year at the time, cheaper than medical school.
Cheaper than preschool.
Cheaper than preschool. And that's how I ended up in law school. I loved my career in the theater. I still hang out with some of my dear friends. You've seen a program I did at Cardozo this year with my friend Lindsay Krause about the Rosenbergs. My friend Mark Bramble, who wrote 42nd Street, recently died, and I'm one of the executors of his estate. I go to everything in the theater. It's kind of like being a musician and changing paths, and Cardozo is filled with alum like that. Lee Warren, who was the general counsel of Michael Kors, Lee was a concert pianist. Went to the Oberlin Conservatory, and he's just one of many dancers, singers. The first two graduates of Cardozo, top of the class, were former New York City ballet dancers. So we creative people, God knows why, but we seem to drift toward law.
Your favorite role was what?
Well, you're going to laugh. Mazeppa in Gypsy, the stripper who plays the trumpet. Why? Because it got a lot of laughs, and you were on stage for 2 brief scenes, and they were absolute scene killers. And then I got to go back to the dressing room and read and crochet and do the stuff that I wanted to do. So I would say for sure that role.
Well, so let's flash to the next chapter of your storied career, 80s, 90s, fashion industry. I guess, for listeners that don't know, Barb really started the legal departments of 3 major brands: Kate Spade, Seven for All Mankind, and Stuart Weitzman. Meaning, before you got there were no lawyers in the house. But 80s, 90s, New York City fashion, the big 4, and by the big 4, I mean Calvin, Donna, Tommy,
Ralph,
and of course Ralph, all coming online, kind of planting a flag for American fashion. What was that like? Were those salad days, or was it hell?
Well, I started my career thinking I was going to be a criminal lawyer, which is a perfect sort of segue from being a theater person. And just by the accident of fate, I needed more money, and I went to a couple of law firms, one big, two small, and ended up at Amster Rothstein representing Ralph Lauren. The firm was a patent firm, but had some big fashion clients, Ralph being the big one. And I was brought in to do enforcement work, anti-counterfeiting work.
On patents or soft IP?
No, soft IP, because it was such a patent-centric firm, but also had a strong trademark practice.
And so for the non-lawyers listening, or the non-IP lawyers, soft IP, copyright, trademark.
Yep. Exactly. So I did, I was very quickly assigned a lot of the Ralph Lauren litigation as an associate, and it became, I guess, kind of my bread and butter in the 6 years that I was there. I really learned about the client, learned about the business, and took a lot of depositions, settled a lot of cases. Those were the days of civil seizures. I mean, it was kind of the beginning of the kind of lawlessness of counterfeiting, and learning to work with the police, with law enforcement, with the FBI, which was a lot of fun, and I think interesting for law enforcement. It was a kind of nice break from their usual cases, but also many of the counterfeiters were bad guys in other arenas.
I can just think of Squad Car 12 saying, "We're the fashion police."
Exactly.
Parked outside of
Chinatown.
Some corner of Chinatown.
Yeah, and it was a great collegial group of people. I got very involved at the time with the international IACC, International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition. I was on the board. I was chairman of the board, and those were the days also of eBay, the beginning of online counterfeiting, and auction sites like eBay. The Tiffany versus eBay lawsuit came a little bit later.
Well, I want to get the chronology, but let's put a pin in and just maybe unpack for listeners counterfeiting versus copying. What's the scale in terms of an item which is knocked off, and what are the appropriate phrases for that?
Sure. Well, knockoff is really kind of a misnomer at times. I mean, there's true counterfeit, which is what you see in Chinatown. This is a Prada bag, same label, same trademark. Convincing consumers, trying to convince consumers that this is the real thing.
This is a Gucci bag. It's just $35.
Exactly, because we can make it cheaper, because we know the factory that dumped it out the back door, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, as we well know, many consumers know perfectly well that it's a fake, that it's a counterfeit. So substantially identical. That is, a simple way for non-lawyers for counterfeit.
Right.
Knockoff is a whole different concept, and infringement also. I mean, obviously, the fashion business, as you've talked about, is a business of inspiration. Most designers are inspired. If you read Women's Wear Daily around market time, you see pages and pages of a designer's inspiration, and it comes
their mood
from
boards.
Exactly, it comes from other eras, and that's okay. Then there's the crossover.
It's necessary, right?
Absolutely.
You can't have a mood board full of naked people.
Exactly.
Or I guess you could. But.
Yes, but so inspiration is okay, and then we get into infringement, and knockoff is, again, I really don't like the word knockoff, because it could mean infringement, and a lot of people use it to mean counterfeiting, and it's kind of neither. So I would say the two concepts that your listeners should keep in mind are, true counterfeits, this is a Prada bag, it's not a Prada bag, versus infringement, which is one designer saying, you copied me.
And one very actionable.
Yes,
on
absolutely.
A trademark basis, certainly, and perhaps on other IP bases. The other, much more difficult.
Exactly.
A wide amount of gray area.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so back to you.
Yes.
And back to 80s, 90s, and leaving private practice and going in-house. How did that happen? Were you sort of the captive associate working for Kate Spade was your first in-house position,
Actually,
correct?
no. My first in-house position was Calvin Klein Jeans,
Okay.
and which was the licensee for
Right.
Calvin Klein.
But they had an in-house legal department
They
at that
had
point in
one
time.
lawyer who was
Okay.
a corporate
Massive,
lawyer,
massive in-house team.
John Jones, 29 years old, and the company went from a $60 million to a $600 million company in about a year, because Calvin Klein jeans were that was the beginning of,
And they had a 29-year-old GC.
exactly.
Wow.
And he hired me. I was at it. He came to an IECC meeting when Calvin Klein Jeans realized it was called the holding company, Designer Holdings, which was a public company. And again, it was the licensee of Calvin Klein for jeanswear. And John came to a IECC meeting because I believe his board, his management said, "Oh my gosh, we have a huge counterfeiting problem," and I was the chairman of that meeting. And I spoke on a panel with Lee Sporn about third-party liability. It was the beginning of suing the deep pocket, suing the landlords, suing flea market owners, etc. And we started chatting, and I overheard him say, "I really need an in-house lawyer to handle enforcement." And I called him the next day and said, "I'd love that job." I had been in law firms for, 12 years, so I was not a neophyte. I mean, I'd been at a big firm for 3 years, 6 years at Amster doing, serious trademark work, was one of the good trade IP firms, and so it just felt like time. It was also, women in partnership was very complicated in those days, particularly in the old world of a patent firm, which was pretty male heavy.
Yeah.
So it was a great opportunity. And John, like all of my jobs, John Jones said, "Okay, come on by tomorrow and meet Arnie Simon, the CEO." And guess I got the job. And I started, I guess, 2 weeks later, and dove right into a lawsuit involving Costco and Calvin Klein jeans, which Doug and
Which I think makes its way into our casebook.
exactly,
Yeah.
and furthermore, which we both teach,
Yeah.
because there's a very good Harvard Business School study of the Warnaco Calvin Klein lawsuit, which is probably one of the key learning tools for any lawyer who wants to know about the pitfalls of licensing. So anyway, that was my first project, was dealing with Costco. And I was there for a year, and then guess what? We were acquired by Warnaco, and which was the licensee and beneficial trademark owner of Calvin Klein for underwear, and so they were just
Massive
consolidating.
business at the time, and still is.
Exactly. So they acquired us a year after I started there, and I lost my job after they kept me on. Actually, I was pretty much the last woman standing, because of the Warnaco Calvin Klein ultimately lawsuit. I had a lot of information, which was useful, and I actually moved over to Warnaco for several months.
Okay.
And
then to Kate Spade to build out their legal department.
right before that, I was at West Point Stevens.
Okay.
Because I had met Lee Sporn, who was assistant general counsel at Ralph Lauren when I was doing all the Ralph Lauren work. And after I left Warnaco, I called Lee and said I need a job, and he said West Point Stevens, which was the Ralph Lauren licensee for home products,
Yep.
and everybody else's licensee for that matter. And he said the assistant general counsel is leaving, really doesn't want to do a big search, go meet him. And I met him, and I got the job. And it was a great 3 years, really learning about the soon to depart textile industry, licensing, because we were everybody's licensee, and also about sourcing, because the business was moving from total U.S. based. West Point Stevens was in Alabama, Georgia, Maine, all over the South Carolina, North Carolina, to China, to Turkey, to Brazil, to all the places where our sheets and towels and home products are now made.
Right.
And I was there for 3 years, and I was in the showroom one day, and a very attractive group of people were poking around, and I said to someone, who was that group? And they said, "Oh, it's the Kate Spade people. They're here. They want to talk to us about maybe becoming their home licensee. And that's how I met the Kate Spade people. I met Robin Marino, who was the CEO. I made a kind of snarky remark about, you guys have a big counterfeiting problem in Chinatown, and I said I'd love to give you some free advice. I said I worked at Calvin Klein. I said I'd love to help you out. So she grabbed my card. She gave me her card. She called me the next day. I went over to the office, met Kate and Andy Spade, laid out a whole enforcement program on a napkin for them, and they called me, within days and said, "Would you like to come work for us?" So that's how I got my first general counsel job.
And what was it like building out the infrastructure for? Because at that point in time, they were probably doing in excess of 10 million at least.
They were almost to 70, they were $70 million business when I left.
Okay.
3 years later. So they were a small business.
Yeah.
It was a really wonderful place I never felt like I was imposing, some kind of order or anything. I mean, they were a family. I mean, It was truly one of the happiest 3 years of my life. They were, I'm sure your listeners know, it was started by Kate and Andy Spade and their two best friends, Elise Ahrens, who's still involved with the Kate Spade brand, it's Kate Spade name, and Pamela, and Robin Marino was the CEO. They were building out. The company at the time was owned, I can't remember if it was 50% thereabouts by Neiman Marcus, which also owned Laura Mercier. So I had a great resource at Neiman Marcus in their legal department.
Right.
They had a wonderful general counsel and a small team that was very helpful. But the first line of attack was counterfeiting, because it was right there in Chinatown.
Yeah.
And I did something which was just common sense, which is call all the other handbag companies, most of whom I knew from IECC and Ralph Lauren and Calvin Klein days, and said, why don't we get together and this was the beginning of teamwork.
Yeah.
The counterfeiting really wasn't about doing it just for your brand, but the more
coordinated action.
Exactly. The more coordination, the more likely you were to get law enforcement involved. So I met with that whole gang, joined the IACC. I think I was chairman of the board. I can't remember if I was chairman of the board during the Kate Spade years or when, but that was the first order of business. And then we also had outside counsel handling our trademarks, and we were such a small company, and there had been a lot of applications globally, so I was charged with kind of, I guess, honing that in, managing it, and took that over, and then slowly other things kind of
the day-to-day reality
exactly.
of a did they have their own brick and mortar?
We
at
have
that
one
point in
store
time?
in Soho, which is I believe still there. It was a freestanding store in Soho. There was some foreign distribution already.
Okay.
There were accounts in Asia, in Japan, I believe, a little bit in Europe. So there was that. Then there was licensing. I spent a lot of time on licensing, because Kate really built that business was really built initially on licensing. And there was an eyewear license already. There was a shoe license with Schwartz and Benjamin. There was Kate loved paper, so there was a Cranes license.
Yeah, I remember
Lots
that.
of really adorable. Totally, it was a really lovely licensing program and very organic. Just like this is what we're interested in, particularly Kate.
And so authentic.
Yeah, and that's why I think it was such a delicious brand at the time.
Indeed. I mean, licensing, a big part of Kate Spade and a lot of brands at that point in time. And a model which is still with us today. Can you describe it a bit, just in terms of both the business and legal realities of what licensing is?
Well, I think for a small brand like Kate Spade, it was a great way to branch into areas that you don't have expertise in. I mean, I think perfume is the perfect fragrance. I mean, how many fashion brands can manufacture fragrance? So
Right.
what do? You enter into a license with an Estee Lauder or a L'Oreal or one of the big brands, which then can make manufacture the perfume and the beauty products, which have health and safety issues, have the expertise to do that.
The packaging,
the
which is
packaging, the manufacturing,
important.
the
And then the distribution,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
Because we
which is
all
different.
know, it's different. It's ground floor typically, or today it's specific retailers that deal with it. Sephora being, kind of one of the main ones.
Exactly, and eyewear, another one. I mean, I always say
Right.
ask my students, where do you buy your glasses? And they say, oh, at my optometrist,
Yeah.
or at one of the eyewear stores, or at the airport. I mean, that is a whole other, and again, health and safety issues, because eyewear has to be UV, UV protectable. Shatterproof, all sorts
Right.
of issues like that, and then other things. When I think of Kate, the cranes, paper, paper collection. Now as brands grow bigger, like Ralph Lauren, they start to buy back their licenses.
And why do they do that?
Because you make more money that way. It's as simple as that. I always say to my students, if the answer to my question is always going to be a dollar sign, almost 90% of the time,
Right.
because it's an investment. And as a brand grows big, I mean, when you enter into a license agreement, the licensee will manufacture the goods, distribute the goods, sell the goods, and pay
No money
you,
out of pocket,
exactly,
other than
and
paying the
pay you,
lawyer to negotiate that
exactly,
license.
and pay you 5% or 7% or 10%, and the rest is theirs. And when you take back those licenses and start to manufacture the product yourself, then you get
That 5 or 7 or 10
Exactly.
cents of the dollar
exactly.
goes the
But you
entire
also-
dollar minus the margin.
Exactly.
And the risk.
Yes,
Absolutely.
and that's I was
Yeah.
just going to say, but then you take back the risk. So
Yeah.
it's and you can't make it go away so easily. Usually, license agreements, if it's a new licensee, you want to, as the licensor, as the brand, you want to make it a short term,
Right.
to test it out, to see what the relationship is like. I mean, licenses can be very risky, and I love teaching our licensing cases. I mean, the Martha
Martha
Stewart
is a great one.
a great case, which involved Macy's, and also the Warnaco Calvin Klein case is a great example of what can go wrong. I mean,
The lawlessness during that time,
yes,
really,
Yes.
in the licensing community. So, Kate Spade, and then Seven for All Mankind.
correct. I left Kate Spade and I hated leaving Kate Spade, but I got a great offer from Seven for All Mankind with a big paycheck boost, and I needed the money to pay for college. So I went to Seven for All Mankind, which was based in LA, but I kind of commuted back and forth. It was the hot luxury denim company at the time. Peter Carell was the CEO. It was gorgeous marketing, PR, beautiful product, and interestingly enough, made in the USA. Unlike the brands that I'd been working
Right.
with.
Well, so you'd done Calvin, you'd done some home and tabletop, and then
Right.
you'd done Kate Spade, which was probably at that juncture mainly accessories outside of the licenses.
Exactly.
So a move into denim as one of the very West Coast based,
Right.
but definitely American, United States based manufacturing. So what were some of the challenges with that bicoastal existence, as well as, again, building out a legal department and a recognition of the importance of the law?
Sure. Well, I got that job through private equity. One of my friends from Calvin Klein Jeans days was working for them as head of licensing, and she called me and said they really need a lawyer. Private equity the legal bills have been very high with outside counsel, and they need some order. And I interviewed, and I got the job, and it was a great company to work for, and it was a great board. It was at the time it was Bear Stearns Merchant Banking, which became Irving Place Capital.
Okay,
A guy
so
named
John
Howard, who
yeah.
I absolutely loved and used to call me the designated adult, and which was a great compliment. But I came in and really brought, I would say, order. I mean, it was a great company. The product was magnificent, but it just needed. They were, when private equity owns a company, it's about ultimately flipping it.
Yeah.
And so you want to be able to answer all those questions that in the next level of investor is going to ask. Tell me about your trademark portfolio, employment issues. I mean, the company was based in Southern California, and most of the language spoke in the factory, which was right there, was Spanish. And are these people documented? Questions related to real estate. We had a couple of freestanding stores, and we're building, a little bit of that. Just everything that makes a company tick.
Yeah. Well, so from there to Stuart Weitzman,
Right.
and now you're in shoes,
Right.
Again with brick and mortar retail,
Yes.
right? Again, I think with some licensing,
Yes.
and I think that's probably because we could do a part one completely on your career and a
Right.
part two on fashion law. So I think that's an appropriate part to go to part two,
Sure.
because you and I both face that question, because we are recognized as fashion lawyers. Well, what is fashion law? And we've skirted around it talking about your
Sure.
experiences, but when you are in an academic setting and you're sitting opposite someone who self-identifies as a real estate lawyer or an IP lawyer or a litigator, how do you describe what fashion law is?
Well, it's the it's business law, really. And you're teaching a wonderful MBA JD course at NYU, which
you started.
And it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
It's a business, and it's a big business. It's bigger than music. It's bigger than, sports. It's bigger than entertainment and movies. And it's so when you think about the business of fashion, we're talking about obviously IP. You're talking about, which you're one of the experts, eponymous brands. When a designer names the company after herself, who owns that trademark. We're talking about employment. Oh my gosh, I spent so much time in my career on employment law.
Certainly during that raft of both intern class actions and
Yes.
then wage and hour, and they still come up for brands.
Absolutely. And dress code.
Yeah.
We're one of the few businesses we're one of the businesses that can tell people we'd like you to dress this way. And I always say to my students, when you go into a Prada store versus going into a Walmart, you're going to see employees dressed in different ways. Headscarves, the Abercrombie case, real estate, privacy. Oh my gosh! I mean, Doug, you and I have been working on the table of contents for our book, and we've
gotten a little farther than that.
Yes, but it's yes, we have it, but it's a whole new world. I mean,
absolutely.
Who knew 20 years ago that privacy was going to be such a big issue? Consumer information about customers. International. It's an international business. So import, export, getting goods in and out of the country.
Yeah.
Trade war. Oh my gosh. I say to my students, you better be watching the news on this trade war with China, because it really, really affects our business.
And brands become international really pretty much right out of the gates.
Oh,
right?
absolutely. I mean, Kate Spade was already international when I got there, as was Seven for All Mankind. It's an international world. The e-commerce, taxes, buying and selling, shipping, distribution, risk. I mean, there's nothing that is not involved in fashion law. And it's when we were doing our table of contents for our next book, I think we said, we're going to do 10 chapters, and suddenly
we were at 17.
We were at 17,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's a very complicated, but again, business-oriented course, and I think it's really, really important, because anybody who wants to represent a fashion designer, I mean, if you've represented pharmaceutical companies, there's certainly some crossovers, but it's a very specific industry. Influencers, advertising, the fact that now, the old world of Vogue and Elle and,
large publishers are
yes,
struggling,
yes,
obviously, and these platforms for social media following
yes,
have become incredibly pervasive,
yes,
and are a great way for a brand to get a story that they feel is authentic out there.
yes.
Well, so let us shamelessly plug the book,
Sure.
even more so than we have, because why wouldn't we? How will this book be different? Different than there are a few books out there
Right.
that are taught in fashion law courses, which mainly are New York law schools and some LA law schools, and
Right.
I know UPenn
Right.
and several others. But how will this book distinguish itself?
Well, it's a book for law students and business students. It will be a case book because our publisher is a
Carolina Press.
Carolina Press, but it will also be a practice book because you and I are both professors of practice. I mean,
Yeah.
we're both we've both been in the business. We know we're not pure academics. In fact, we're teaching because the ABA.
This is about as academic as I get
Yes.
with the bow tie. We both like to bring a lot of practical reality
Yes.
into the classroom, along with the theory.
Yes, exactly.
Because I think that those blend well together.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's why we're teaching, and that's why we've both been sought after as teachers because we know the business, and our students constantly comment that we bring practice to the table. We teach a course, by the way, just to shamelessly plug our FIT course. We teach a course at Cardozo called the Fashion Law Practicum, where our students who have taken fashion law from
you.
from me for a semester advise FIT master's level students, all professionals, in their capstone projects, which are basically building entrepreneurial businesses.
Yeah.
And they all routinely comment that they learned so much.
It's an excellent course. I mean, I didn't have anything like that when I was going through NYU, both as a law student and a business school student, because the proximity of FIT is a tremendous one, and the ability for our students to have a virtual client that is pretty close to real.
Yes.
Right? I mean, some of these FIT students put those business ideas directly into practice, and so that's a great course. So about Cardozo, you started Fame.
Yes.
Describe Fame a bit. You and Lee.
Yeah, we started Fame.
And the acronym stands for
Fashion, Arts, Media, Entertainment, and we basically started. We took all of the courses that Cardozo has always taught in counseling creative types and put them under the Fame umbrella. We always had a music law course. We always had media and entertainment law courses. I had been teaching fashion law there for at least 7-8 years. And sports, which also falls under Fame. We've always had a very strong sports law department. And we said, you know what? Fashion is not about fashion anymore. I mean, it's, as we well know, most fashion companies are involved in entertainment, are involved in the Academy Awards.
It's
the
story
Tonys.
creation,
Exactly.
right? I mean, to induce a consumer, to buy a garment, which, let's face it, most of them are based on garments that were made before.
Yep.
They inherently have a function, but it's that story creation behind it, which that and quality for sure. But there's a lot of quality product out there. What differentiates and what creates a higher price point is latching into the minds of the consumer and that story resonating and making them feel that way when they don the clothes.
I mean, we think about the Met Ball last week, you know, and the entertainers at the Met Ball and the designers. I mean, how many designers have been launched by creating beautiful garments for entertainers?
Well, and Rihanna this week announcing that she and LVMH are starting a brand together in partnership from ground zero.
Pharrell Williams,
Right.
Swiss Beats, Alicia Keys' husband is. I'm eager to get him to come speak at
That
Cardozo
would be
because
a good one.
he's an art collector. He's a sneaker designer. He's a Harvard Business School graduate. He's a
Renaissance.
Renaissance man,
Yeah.
and that's the crossover back to fame. That's what makes fame interesting, and it's not just our courses, but it's also our CLE We have wonderful programs. I mean, this year we had Kenneth Cole. We had last year we had Isaac Mizrahi. We had Clive Davis. We've had, we've just had so many interesting. Sheila Evans, producer of documentaries at HBO. It's a great program, and I'm really, really proud of it, and I'm proud that you're part of it.
Yes, I too participate on the Fame board, and I find it both rewarding, but as well, because I also teach at NYU, I think it distinguishes Cardozo as having that focus. So back to dressing and how brands create these stories, and how lawyers protect these stories. As far as personal presentation, you and I both are law professors, but practitioners. So how do you choose to get yourself ready, whether it's for teaching or appearing on a podcast or showing up for work? And what do your apparel choices say about you? And we'll dovetail that into, you can also talk about what you're in today by letting us know who you're wearing and what season it is, if you know.
Thank you. Well, I love...
Thanks for that.
I love new young designers, and I have many of them in my life. So I have to tell you that I wear and buy mostly everything from one or other of my young designer friends. Today I'm wearing a jacket designed by Margarita Serrano, who is a lawyer who was my intern several summers ago when I was at Stuart Weitzman, and she had a passion for design, and I said, go for it, girl. Life is short. Having left the theater to go into law, I started my life with a creative piece, and never regretting that. I said to her, go for it, and she did. And she is a perfect example of the way a new designer works these days. She doesn't work with retail. Everything is her website. She has an office. When she's in New York, she has some space down on Spring. You probably know that place.
Yeah.
It's where a lot of designers it's kind of like we work for designers.
Right.
She manages her own models, and she has a very good friend who's a model, who she met through one of my other students. I mean, they're a very small world. So Margarita Serrano, almost all my jackets are hers. I'm wearing Theory pants today because I love the brand and they make the best pants. And I'm wearing, of course, Stuart Weitzman shoes. I never have to buy another pair of shoes in my life because 6 years at Stuart and 3 years at Kate Spade, I have shoes. So what I buy, at this point in my life, almost everything I buy is from somebody I know. Be it jewelry or accessories or a handbag. It's just I feel it's really, really important for me to support young designers. I'm wearing a Calvin Klein belt.
Of course you are.
From the old
you
days.
probably set on belts for the rest of your life too.
Exactly.
Well, for younger lawyers starting out or mid-levels, and here I want to speak specifically to women, because you're an icon to many, but you entered an industry at a time, the industry is still slanted well towards men, and white men, let's face it, in terms of positions, executive positions. And the lawyer often works with the designer, but at higher levels, the lawyer works with the executives.
Right.
What do you think is an appropriate way for a lawyer to dress? And, I think it's a challenge in many workplaces, particularly what's traditionally been considered a white-collar workplace,
Right.
because women don't have a lot of tailored clothing options. So maybe speak to that, speak to how you dealt with it in the 80s and 90s, and how you would advise young lawyers to deal with it today.
I think it's important to look at the place where you're working, the culture of the place that you're working. Law firms, it's still appropriate to dress the way other women dress in at those law firms. I think the day of the suit is maybe behind us. I actually always wore pants to work because I always felt more comfortable with pants. And as you know, I ride a bicycle to work.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I think the fit is important. I find it, I'm always amazed at women who wear things that are kind of too tight or too low cut. I think having good foundation wear is important. And there's so many people to ask. I mean, in the men's world, you have a wonderful book now, which is specifically addressed to men. In the there's not a lot. I mean, I think the women's wear in the workplace is changing so dramatically. I would recommend any woman who came to me and said, who do I talk to about dressing for work? I would probably refer to my friend Sherry Jeter, who was at Ralph Lauren,
Right.
and at Donna Karan, and
Very
other
well
places.
put together
She
and very professional.
She puts herself
Yeah.
together beautifully. She wears a lot of stuff from the old days and knows how to put it together. There are wonderful stylists who don't charge a lot of money, but again, it depends on the place.
Yeah. One of the challenges, so when I wrote the Laws of Style last year, and the ABA is my publisher, I was very reluctant to tackle women's wear. And I think it's a woman who needs to write, the Laws of Style for women,
Yeah.
or pick her own title. But my book addresses mainly what men face in an era of business casualization,
Right.
where they are now outside of the comfort zone, perhaps,
Yeah.
of being able to wear a suit every day. Although they certainly can wear a suit every day, and that might be good practice for people who, are uncomfortable in anything else. To a degree, women have been saddled with that ever since
Yeah.
they've joined the workplace
Sure.
and the workforce. And here I'm speaking specifically at law firms or in-house as lawyers, because there hasn't really been a great uniform
Right.
for women. I mean,
Well, let me tell you something interesting. I was at Hudson Yards last week, and I went into Brooks Brothers, which I went into Brooks Brothers actually a few months ago looking for shirts, and I found two fabulous, women's dress shirts, kind of mannish type, which I loved, and good price, and as you know, Zach Posen's been
Yeah.
designing for Brooks Brothers, and look, if I were a first-year associate at Sherman and Sterling, I think I would start at Brooks Brothers, because the level of style has really been
elevated.
I
Yeah.
mean, dresses, adorable, not really suits, but jackets and skirts,
Yeah.
wonderful pants.
Well, Brooks Brothers for men and women,
Yeah.
I think, particularly for workwear in a conservative setting,
Yeah.
has been great. And infusing it with Zach's designs, because Zach is a true talent. And
Yeah.
before that, Tom Brown
Yeah.
had his Black Fleece collection there. I think it's still there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's absolutely a great suggestion. I think one of the further challenges that, again, in writing the book, I wanted to steer far clear of is in the workplace, women being sexualized
Yeah.
in ways that men are not. And so maybe I'll put that question to you, not so much in guidance for young lawyers, but what did you face in the 80s, 90s in the workplace as the general counsel, which is often considered the bucket of cold water, the person that says no or stop or you can't do that, to potentially a room full of men?
I was always in a room full of men. The room where it happened was the room filled with men. And, I was very cautious with my, I remember once some very young finance guys came to West Point Stevens and came into my office, which was clearly a executive office, and said, "Where's the coffee?" And I said, "It's in the kitchen. Go make it."
In your face, in your face, if you stand in my doorway any
exactly.
longer.
But I wasn't snarky. I just said, "In the kitchen. Go
Yeah,
make it."
yeah.
Like I always kind of joked about it. Where I really drew the line is being asked, and this could happen to men and women, and look at what's going on in DC right now, to do anything illegal. And sometimes creative people don't realize, we really can't cut a CD of all those songs that we don't have rights to, or we really can't use that picture of, such and such a celebrity without paying for it. So it's a lot about education.
Yeah.
I was so busy as a aging startup lawyer. I don't mean me aging, but the company's aging startups, that I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the way I was treated. I kind of went to work and did my work. And I don't have any real horror stories, except for salary issues, but, just gender disparity, and, finding out what other people made, or finding out who got how much when the company was sold.
Right.
But that's very true of my whole generation. And what I'm still surprised to hear from my students, because my Cardozo alum and NYU alum and Fordham alum come to talk to me about Me Too issues that they're having in the workplace, and I'm quite shocked at how much is still going on despite all of the press. Both in big firms and small, but particularly in small firms where somehow they haven't gotten the memo yet,
Right.
that we just don't talk to women like this, and we don't show those pictures on the screen, and we don't look somebody up and down in a lascivious way. I mean, they're still really struggling. They're also struggling tremendously with pay disparity. I mean, I got to tell you that, and it's fashion companies are guilty of it as well as our law firms, paying lawyers, $65,000-$70,000 after they graduate from law school to work 12-hour lawyer days. Come on. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but you know who you are. I mean, it's shocking, and I'm happy to be the mentor, in terms of helping them negotiate better salary, helping them dig in their heels and say, no, I can't work for that, and helping women say that's inappropriate. I mean, the problem with startups is that there's not often an HR department. I mean,
Right.
human resources. There's not any not just fashion companies, but small law firms.
Yeah.
My first question will be, have you talked to HR about this? And the answer is, well, we don't have HR. Oh my God, But that's the way it was when I went to Kate Spade. We one of the, it was a small company. We weren't there yet. Those are support staff.
Yeah.
And the last group to get hired, we're talking about design. We need designers. We need the tech pack people. We need the manufacturers. Yeah, lawyers, HR. We'll get to that when we get sued, which is
Right.
often what happens.
And on usually a employee or employment related matter.
Exactly.
Out of the gates. Is there any shift that you've seen over the last 5 years, 10 years in terms of C-suites, executives being at least growing numbers of women, or on boards of directors, or do you feel that it's still locked up?
It's still slow, way too slow. I mean, it's, very few direct boards have 50% women. I would, the best advice I would have for women is the more business experience you have, that JD MBA, the more spreadsheet and business plan, and really knowing the guts of the finances of a business is very important on a board. But it's it's still a slog, in my humble opinion.
Well, pivoting a little bit, we've talked about some of the advice that you might give, in terms of brands for young lawyers to wear, but just from your perspective, more on the business side, what are some brands that you think are interesting, or doing it right from either a design perspective or a customer engagement perspective?
Well, I think young people, really care about sustainability. And
Glad you mentioned that, because that
Yes.
was my next question.
Yes.
So let's conflate
I think
them.
that is I mean, listening to the news, if we can get through the noise of, Trump and everything else, I mean, the big issue right now is there going to be a world for our children and our grandchildren? And we've seen, this is the time.
Yeah. And this is one of the world's dirtiest
Yes,
businesses.
we are very guilty of dumping. There's a wonderful cartoon in the New Yorker a few weeks ago based on the Marie Kondo book of getting rid of stuff, and it's like a big pile of apparel in the middle of the ocean coming to a point, and we've got to figure that out. Eileen Fisher, I think, is extraordinary in terms of looking at that problem, straight on, and has been for a long time. We did a panel at Cardozo recently and had one of her folks speak, and she was very compelling. So real sustainability. I'm not talking about just the words, but really, really doing something. Also, I like, I'm very interested in the younger designers like the Margarita Serranos who are doing it without the help of the big box department stores. Doing it, how is she going to grow? Of course, she's going to need, financing. Somebody's going to buy her at some point, and then the business will change. I've been through this, and this is going to be the real issue to watch because businesses change.
Yeah.
When Spade was acquired first by Liz Claiborne, then, it's not the same brand. Let's face it.
Well, and that's the model of I want to create a brand that ultimately gets sold. I want a liquidity moment for all my efforts, and that is we were brought up being taught that way. That's you see examples of billionaires all over the planet now who have had those moments, but there's also another model, which is I just want to live my life making beautiful things, making people happy, and making money, but never necessarily having that true moment of monopoly money or buy an island money and retire, which in a lot of ways I feel is how the early European houses started. It was a family business. It was handed down. I mean, I know we're in a completely different time where it's rare that a daughter or a son does what a mother or a father did necessarily, but in that era, it wasn't necessarily we're going to IPO at some point in time. It was more Gucci's a great example, and there's a great book about it, which goes into a lot of how it went sideways from time to time, as families do. But I am seeing young designers sometimes adopt that kind of an approach, which is I'm just going to do this because I'm making some money doing it, and I love it, and I can't not do it.
And then you look at someone like Stuart Weitzman, who did it because he loved it, but his two daughters did not want to be in the business, so he's in his 70s, getting up there, and wanted to make sure his business lived on, and going through the many owners. It's a big challenge, and as you know, he's not part of the business anymore. Originally, he's smart and out there and doing, I call it the TED Talk circuit, and he's speaking at Penn's graduation, and they're naming the design school after him. So he's in many ways kind of lived his dream, but his brand is not his brand anymore, and that has to be difficult for somebody, because the truth is, once your brand is sold, this is what, back to the European brands, this is what they do so well. I mean, you look at LVMH, you look at, Marc Jacobs, and, the brands that they have absorbed.
Sort of incubated and nurtured.
Didn't steal their thunder, didn't try to turn them into something that they weren't. And I think they're better at that than we are.
Well, it brings up an interesting point that you and I talk about sometimes in class, which is maybe the new model of the U.S.-based conglomerate, which we've seen with Michael Kors changing the name of his holding company to Capri Holdings and making several investments, several acquisitions of other brands, as well as Coach, renamed Tapestry.
Right.
What do you think of that as a business model. And I know it would be early,
Yeah.
early returns in terms of how those brands are doing. But what do you think? You think we can do it right here in the U.S.?
I don't know. I mean, the jury's still out. I
Yeah.
was involved in, obviously in the Tapestry acquisition. Um, um, I have not been in a Stuart Weitzman store since those days. I've been in Kate Spade stores since it's not the brand that I knew and loved. But look, I don't want to judge because let's again, the jury's still out. Let's see how it goes, kind of long term.
Yeah.
And it's it's it it allows a brand to live on. I mean, and Stuart will be the first to tell you that. He spoke at Cardozo recently. It allows his name and his company to continue, but it's not his company anymore.
Right.
And Kate Spade's business, she was not involved. Neither she nor Andy were involved in that business. I remember Andy Spade saying to me on the street several years after they sold that company, he said, I heard a TED Talk recently, and the speaker said that a brand is like sending your kid off to college. You keep them home and you raise them right, and then you have to send them to college.
Right.
But he did use the expression 5 years, which is a little different than sending your kid off to college. But he said a brand should be, incubated for 5 years, and then you sell it off.
Yeah.
I think he and Kate were very smart people, and they felt like they did what they did. And gosh, when you look at that brand at the time it was sold, it was perfection.
Yeah.
Sheer perfection, in my humble opinion.
Yeah.
I mean, and so maybe it was time for them to move on. Of course, the story has a sad ending, but
Of course. Yeah.
and
Well, maybe it's a somber way to close, but I would love your thoughts on how pressure-filled this industry is. I mean, there's so much glamour associated with it. We see designers in the best light usually. Yeah. How hard is it? I mean, you've known some of these designers as I do very, very well, and they put a brave face up. But apropos of Kate and apropos of Stuart doing well, but having sort of watching his brand sail off away from him. What are some of the pressures you've seen, and what are some of the cautionary points of guidance you could give for a practitioner who has to acknowledge that their client faces those challenges?
Sure. Well, I think first, building a brand is hard work, and Stuart worked 24 hours a day. Kate and Andy Spade in their team worked 24 hours a day. And I think there's a point at which, one gets tired and there's no break. And that's true for we lawyers in-house too. I say this to my students all the time when they want to move from, for example, a big law, even with the hours, or a smaller law firm to in-house. I remind them I lost my job 4 times in my career, and not always at the best times in my life when companies get acquired. That you're the merger, the intensity of the merger, and then goodbye.
Yeah.
So it's a hard business, and when you think about all the brands in my lifetime that don't even exist anymore, and you read about a brand that's closing shop, and then maybe comes back. I think the we haven't really talked about this, but Authentic Brands Group, Global Brands Group, the Centrix, I think it's called, there are all these marquee brands, Sequential, all the Iconics, all these holding companies that buy up brands that have been sold, kind of didn't work out, and then, end up with these holding companies, which are basically licensing companies.
And let's face it, they're kind of wringing the last bit of consumer goodwill
Yes.
out of those brands,
Yes.
because it's not like they're really elevating them.
No.
They're not saying, hey, let's acquire Band of Outsiders and elevate it back to $1 billion
Right.
company. The model is more, there's still some goodwill here.
Yeah.
Let's
Or
find...
Juicy Couture. Remember when Juicy Couture was
Exactly.
the hottest brand on earth?
Let's sew it into cheap underwear
Exactly.
and sell it at Kohl's and Walmart and see how
Exactly.
much more we can get out of it.
Yeah, and you wonder how the founders feel about that, but hopefully they're happy with the money they walked away with. And some founders, like the woman who started Burt's Bees, took her money and bought all this land in Maine to preserve it. I mean, people do wonderful things with their money. Stuart, now having a design school named after him, and being on the speaking tour and he loves talking to students. I mean, people, that gets into what makes us happy, and I think the key is, I'll tell you, this is a good sort of closing story. When I went to Warnaco after we were acquired by Calvin Klein Jeans, after Calvin Klein Jeans was acquired by Warnaco, I moved to Warnaco's offices at 90 Park Avenue, and I was asked to wear a beeper. And I had a young child, and I said, I'm not going to wear a beeper. And this is actually a good story related to your question about women. And I said, I'm not going to wear a beeper. And they said, well, everybody in the C-suite, you have to wear a beeper. I said, we make underwear and jeans. I said, why would you need to beat me in the middle of the night? No. So I refused to wear a beeper at Warnaco. Yeah. And I think that's the key here, is that we have to keep our lives in perspective. It's a very, very high pressure business, and it's easy to get swallowed up into it. And I have friends who have been swallowed up into it and foregone marriage and children and relationships and travel, and as we all know, your gravestone is not going to say, I wish I'd been to Singapore.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is a great closing point, because it is very much enjoy the ride, enjoy the process, and being involved in the fashion industry. There is so much to enjoy in the day-to-day. Barb, that's a wrap. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
You already have a copy of The Laws of Style, but you'll get another one at the end of today. And any social media handles or other shout outs to our listeners before we close?
Please check out the FAME website, which has a lot of programs, especially for you young lawyers, CLE programs. Watch Doug's podcasts. They're fabulous. And it's a great way to really learn about the business if you are thinking about making that move from, say, a law firm to in-house, or even if you're a fashion professional looking professionally, and look for our book.
The Law of the Business of Fashion.
Yes.
Thanks, Barb.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Laws of Style with Douglas Hand. For more information, go to our website at www.hballp.com. And you can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Hand of the Law. Thank you for tuning in, and stay stylish.